Very good. So let us start by writing one example here. Our example says, verify the following. So the very first one says, on the left-hand side, you have secant squared of theta minus 1 divided by this -1 is next to your function, next to your y value, not next to theta, divided by secant squared of theta. This is our left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we have sine squared of theta. So our goal is to show that, well, left-hand side is the same as right-hand side. So our goal is to show that the left-hand side, which is this fraction, is the same as the right-hand side, So when you have something like this, when the question says, hey, verify left-hand side is the same as right-hand side, you can either start by taking left-hand side and reaching to the right-hand side, or you can start by taking right-hand side and showing that that right-hand side is equal to left-hand side. So in this case, it's easier for me to simplify this fraction. So I'm going to start by writing left-hand side. The left-hand side is this fraction here. You have secant squared of theta minus 1 divided by secant squared of theta. Okay, so we can see. Very well. So here I have a fraction. I want to simplify this fraction. This is my goal. This is what I want to do. But how do I do that? Well, okay, let's see what do we have here, what we can do. The very first thing you can do is to write your secant as 1 over cosine. Or you might say, hey, I know secant squared is 1 plus tangent squared. So you can either say, hey, secant is 1 over cosine, and just substitute that here and try to take common denominator and then simplify that. Or you might say that I know that secant squared of theta is 1 plus tangent squared of theta. So my numerator becomes, so instead of secant squared, instead of this guy, I'm going to write 1 plus tangent squared of theta. So my numerator becomes 1 plus tangent squared of theta, and my numerator already has a 1 minus 1. My denominator stays the same. I'm going to copy down my denominator as secant squared of theta. So obviously 1 minus 1 is 0. So this fraction becomes tangent squared of theta divided by secant squared of theta. Okay, guys, what do you have here? You have tangent squared. Remember the definition of tangent. It is sine divided by cosine. At the same time, you have secant squared on the denominator. Remember, secant of theta is defined as 1 over cosine of theta. So you have the following case. your tangent squared becomes sine squared of theta divided by cosine squared of theta. On the denominator, secant squared is 1 over cosine squared. Secant squared of theta is 1 over cosine squared of theta. So I have 1 over cosine squared of theta. Remember that from algebra, A over B divided by C over B, you can cancel out the same denominators and you're left with A over C. Here you have sine squared divided by cosine squared. On the denominator, you also have another fraction, which is 1 over cosine squared. So you can cancel out cosine squared and cosine squared. You're left with sine squared of theta, which is the same as your right-hand side. So we just proved this. Another example. So here we have another verify. Our second one says, well, I have 2 times secant squared of alpha equals to 1 over 1 minus sine alpha plus 1 over 1 plus sine alpha. Okay, let's see what do we have here. We have left-hand side, we have right-hand side. So our goal is to show that the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. This is my left-hand side, and this is my right-hand side. Well, since I have fractions here, and I feel comfortable working with fractions, I'm going to start by starting from right-hand side. So let us start by simplifying the right-hand side. So my right-hand side is the combination of fractions 1 over 1 minus sine alpha plus 1 over 1 plus sine alpha. Okay, again, let's go back to algebra. Remember what we learned before in combining fractions. So this is the case that you have. You have 1 over a minus b plus 1 over a plus b. Okay. To combine these two fractions, you need to have the same denominator, but here you have 2 different denominators. What are you going to do? You're going to multiply the first fraction by a plus b. You're going to multiply the second fraction by a minus b, and then try to take common denominator. So this guy becomes 1 times 1 plus b, a plus b divided by a minus b times a plus b plus, now the second fraction, 1 times a minus b divided by a plus b times a minus b. Okay, now that they have the same denominator, you are allowed to combine the numerators. This guy becomes a plus b plus a minus b divided by, guys, the multiplication between a minus b and a plus b results in a squared minus b squared. Then you cancel out b and negative b, you're left with 2a over a squared minus b squared. So this is the algebra that we did for different types of expressions. Now, instead of these expressions, they have functions, trig functions. The process is the same. There's no difference. There you go. So we're going to multiply the first fraction by 1 plus sine alpha. The second fraction by 1 minus sine alpha. This guy becomes 1 times 1 plus sine alpha divided by 1 minus sine alpha times 1 plus sine alpha. Plus, the operation is addition. Now the second fraction, 1 times 1 minus sine alpha, 1 plus sine alpha times 1 minus sine alpha. Again, here you have multiplication between 1 minus sine alpha and 1 plus sine alpha, a minus b times a plus b, which is a squared minus b squared. So you're going to get one denominator, which is 1 minus sine squared of alpha, and on the numerator, if you add these two, negative sine alpha and sine alpha, they cancel out each other. You're left with 1 plus sine alpha plus 1 minus sine alpha. You're left with 1 plus 1, which is 2, divided by 1 minus sine squared of alpha. Very good. But what is 1 minus sine squared of alpha? Recall that sine squared plus cosine squared is always 1. It means that 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. So cosine squared of alpha, beta, theta is 1 minus sine squared of that angle. So this guy becomes 2 over cosine squared of alpha. But what is cosine squared? 1 divided by cosine squared. Remember that when we talked about sine and cosine, we said that we can easily flip those. We defined secant of theta as 1 over cosine. Very good. So 2 divided by cosine squared is 2 times secant squared of alpha, which is the same as my left-hand side. So we just prove right-hand side is the same as left-hand side. Let's take a look at another example.